Today we are at the Portland Boat Show, and in this video we're going to discuss everything that I wish I knew before I bought my first boat. Just kidding, that was not my first boat, but it got your attention. We're going to be talking about heavy gauge aluminum boats in this video, things to look for, features to look for, what to look for when buying a used boat, and what you might want for your use case on a heavy gauge aluminum Northwest style boat. Now most of these heavy gauge aluminum boats are going to be 18 foot and larger. There are a few 16 foot models out there. So let's talk about a little bit about the differences between the size classes of boats. The 16 to 18 footer class are great for lakes, bays, decent days on most rivers. They're gonna do just fine. Buoy 10, not sure I'd wanna take anything smaller than 18 foot out to buoy 10. That's kind of dicey. I've seen it, but the weather can turn fast out there. Waves get big really quick, and the smaller sidewall height and the smaller transom depth yields to less safety margin when the seas turn rough. Ocean, I wouldn't do that on an 18 footer unless it was the calmest of calm days. Now the 18 to 20 foot class of boat, we're starting to get into some real capability here. It can handle rougher weather. The sidewall height is taller. Typically, it'll have a slightly sharper V, especially on the boats that have an offshore bracket. Those will have a sharper V than the Splashwell smaller boats have, thus allowing for a smoother ride in rougher water. And the taller transom height as well as taller sidewall height leaves you a lot more safety margin. And then there's the 21 plus class. Now, you have to be careful with 21 footers because some 21 footers are just a long 20 footer. Some 21 footers are just a short 22. In the case of the North Rivers, that's how it is. And I think Thunderjet does this as well, where the 21 foot class, it gets anywhere between 3 and 6 inches wider, and your sidewalls get 3 to 5 inches taller between the 20 foot and the 21 foot and up. It does come at a cost. These boats typically on the used market for 21 and up typically sell for at least $10,000 more than a 20 footer. But you're gaining extra sidewall height, extra transom height, sharper V, well, in the case of North River, a heavier duty bottom plate on the hull, more fishing space. This is the class of boat you want at minimum, especially for buoy 10 in the ocean. This class of boat is where you really start to get into some real capabilities of making sure that you can get home if weather turns south on you unexpectedly. Now, it's still not going to perform as well as the big offshore boats in really rough water, but it'll get you home. The biggest thing to know is that boats under 20 feet must have reserve buoyancy foam in the boat somewhere enough to make the hull float. This is very important when we start talking about saltwater versus freshwater or the longevity of the hull. Some manufacturers have over the years put foam in their larger boats because it is an important safety thing. A lot of them have stopped in recent years though because it can promote corrosion in the boat. Now the majority of Northwest style boats are going to be just like this one, flat floor, open layout with a bench seat and a bench seat. And then up here we'll have either seat boxes like these two, suspension seats, or pedestal seats that are in fixed locations. That doesn't leave much room for foam. So they put it under the deck, or they'll put it up underneath this bow compartment in front of the console if they need more foam than what they can fit underneath the deck. Why is foam bad? Typically the foam is sprayed in. It's a two-part expanding foam that gets sprayed in at the factory, and it shapes itself to the hull and holds itself against the hull. What happens is when water eventually gets down in between the foam and the hull, it can't dry out. When it gets held there and it can't dry out, it starts to corrode the aluminum. This is made even worse in a salty environment like a lot of these boats get used in. Bays, buoy 10, the ocean, all of those are saltwater environment, and especially in scenarios like crabbing where you are dragging salt water into the boat in reasonably large volumes for as far as water coming into the boat goes that doesn't involve your boat getting swamped. The water getting trapped into foam with salt in it really becomes an issue and can start to corrode your boat away. So while most manufacturers of 22 foot boats or 21 foot boats and larger have stopped putting foam in their hulls, just make sure that if you're buying a used boat that's older, keep that in mind that it's something to check for, and if it has foam, make sure it's not saturated, and just plan on removing it if it's over 20 feet. Now, if your budget, storage situation, towing situation, whatever has you stuck under 20 feet, you're gonna have foam in the boat, and a lot of guys do remove it. I don't necessarily recommend that. I don't know the legality of it. Do that at your own risk, but that definitely will prolong the life of your boat, being able to actually wash all the salt out and get it off of the hull. So let's talk about the hull shape and construction a little bit. On this AlumaWeld Striker here, this is a smaller boat. I believe this is going to be a 17 or an 18 foot. And these boats typically have which is fine for this smaller class of boat. It's not going to be quite as robust as the larger boats, but it's going to survive some lighter hits. These boats are engineered to be tough. These smaller boats have a shallower V than the larger boats. Once you get up into the boats that have offshore brackets on them, either at 18 foot or 20 foot and 21 foot plus boats, it's going to have a sharper V every time you go up in class. So if we look at this 22 foot North River here with the offshore bracket, you can see that V at the transom is much sharper, and I think it's an 18-degree transom, and the bow is 41 degrees. It's a very sharp bow for cutting through the water. Because this 22 foot North River is so much wider than the 17 or 18 foot AlumaWeld we were just looking at, if it's had the same V shape, it would pound a lot harder as it was going through the water. So the steeper V helps it cut versus pound. Also, it being a wider hull means that it will be more stable even with the sharper V. So you kind of get the best of both worlds as you go up in size of boat. Now here, we have a boat that's probably 20 to 22 feet long. It's gonna be my guess, it might be a 23. This is an AlumaWeld Super V right here. And you can see the V on it is a lot shallower. So this is gonna have a harsher ride on plane, on rougher water, but it's going to be extremely stable, and it's also going to run shallower. You'll also notice this boat has a flat spot known as a delta pad right here at the center of the transom. And what that does is it allows you to run a jet foot on your outboard for running in really, really shallow water. Another important factor with the bottoms of the hulls is not just the V, but the hull thickness. So you'll see on this 22 foot North River, this has a 1/4 inch thick plate of aluminum. So if you hit something with this, it's a lot less likely to be damaged than the thinner plate that was on that smaller AlumaWeld that we were looking at earlier. Not all large boats use that thick of hull material. If we look at this 20 foot Duckworth Advantage, this is gonna have a 3/16 inch thick plate on the bottom of the hull. Some manufacturers still use 3/16 on their 21 plus class of boats. Not necessarily the end of the world. There's been a lot of boats out there with the 3/16 hull for a very long time that are still in great condition. But having the thicker hull material on the bottom is beneficial. Now, those thicker hull materials do come at a cost. One, monetarily, they're more expensive to manufacture and more expensive to purchase the materials for. It's also heavier, so that's more weight to tow and a larger tow vehicle that you may have to have. That's an important consideration depending on how you are going to be using your boat. Now let's talk offshore brackets versus splash wells for a minute. For 20 foot and under, a lot of times you'll find boats that have either a splash well or an offshore bracket. This one in particular, this Duckworth, has a splash well. What that means is that when water hits the back of this boat and splashes over the top of the transom, say it's a wave or somebody's wake, it's going to come into this bowl right here and eventually wash down and out this hole that is in the transom. This keeps your boat from getting swamped. Now over here on this North River, we have one style of offshore bracket. This one is a buoyancy bracket. So that means that the planing surface of the boat is extended out to where the motor is. And this bracket is actually part of what's floating the boat. This is a big deal. What this does, this adds about 600 pounds of flotation, which happens to be about the same weight as an outboard that's picking up on the outboard. Now you'll notice the back of the boat right here. This is the back of the main floating part of the boat. The outboard is right here. When we look at this boat, here's the back of the main floating portion of the boat. Look how much further back the outboard is. What that's doing is that's turning this point right here, without that flotation, that's turning this point right here into a teeter-totter, so that even at rest, the motor is trying to torque the boat this way, and that can contribute to porpoising, or when the bow of the boat does this as you're underway. Also, without the flotation bracket, it will make the boat sit bow high at rest, especially in this class or this class of boats. And this Thunderjet here has an offshore bracket that is a non-flotation bracket. So you can see the planing surface stops at the transom of the boat. So you have, in this case, two outboards that are acting as a lever on the fulcrum point here, trying to lift the bow out of the water all the time, especially when you're underway. Now, less of an issue on this particular boat because you have the weight of all of this huge hardtop cabin up here, the pilot house, but soft top boat that doesn't weigh very much, having a flotation bracket is very important. If you're ever out trolling and you see a boat that doesn't have a flotation offshore bracket on it, especially one that's a soft top, look at it and you'll notice that it's at rest, it is sitting bow high instead of level in the water. Biggest advantage to the offshore bracket versus a Splashwell is you have so much more space between the engine mount and the height of the transom of the boat. So the water has to go so much higher, and especially on this on the 21 plus class of boats, it's an extra 3 inches taller typically. So it's even that much higher that water has to go before it can get into the boat. You have to be in a really bad situation to get water in the boat with an offshore bracket. On a Splashwell boat, it's a little bit higher chance of getting water inside of the boat, especially on a Splashwell designed like this one. What we have here is a 20-inch tall transom. The wing here is going to be 25 inches, but still, water can easily splash up and over. It could splash onto this and wash in, or it could swamp the entire Splashwell and get into the boat because the front of the Splashwell is only a couple inches taller than the transom itself. So if a big rogue wave or a big wake hits the stern of that boat, higher chance of it getting swamped versus a boat that has an offshore bracket. Now let's talk about kicker location. On these larger boats, there's a handful of ways to operate your kicker. Number one, I'm actually going to start over here on the Thunderjet. The kicker bracket is mounted to the offshore bracket and is steered at the steering wheel from the helm. This setup works great in the ocean and big open water. Does not work very well when you're trolling in heavy traffic like we do on the Columbia, where having a tiller is beneficial, but is the most common in these big offshore boats because they're always out on the open water. Here we have an example of the kicker being mounted on a bracket that's welded to the transom, and it's much closer to the boat. Now this setup is my favorite because the kicker is closer to the boat than it is on my boat. My boat is like that Thunderjet over there with the kicker mounted on the end of the offshore bracket. This brings the kicker in closer for more comfortable time running the tiller, and you can run a shorter extension in order to be able to reach it from the floor inside. You can also run these with a tie bar between the main motor and the kicker. I personally don't like to do that. I'm gonna say this is my second favorite setup that we're gonna look at. Now on this Duckworth that has the Splashwell, the kicker motor is mounted directly to the transom, and you can see The handle comes up right here. You've got easy access to reach it from inside of the boat. This is probably the most common setup for boats. Well, this is definitely the most common setup for boats that don't have an offshore bracket. But there's something you're gonna notice about all three of these boats, and that's which side the kicker is mounted on. Doesn't really matter for this one. A lot of times, manufacturers will mount the kicker on the port side or the left side of the boat because that's opposite of the driver, to kind of offset the driver's weight. And I actually really disagree with that. Number one, in the case of my boat, when I'm on plane, the torque of the prop naturally rotates the boat to that side. So then I have to use my trim tabs to flatten the boat out. The other big issue is the location of the tiller handle on most kickers. Most kickers have the tiller handle on the left side of the motor here. Tiller handle on the left side of the motor. Tiller handle on the left side of the motor. I'm using this one specifically as an example. I used it in my small boat video as well, because this shows the problem with having the kicker mounted on the left side and the handle on the left side. What happens when you have to turn left? You start hitting things. You have to pick the handle up in order to do a full lock turn, which in this case kind of hits the other motor, and that's not a good thing. You have to kick the handle up in order to turn all the way if you have to make a really sharp turn. Additionally, if I'm standing here running the kicker, this is the only spot that I can stand, period. I have to stand on the left side in order to have my hand on the tiller handle to operate the kicker. If the kicker was mounted over here, I could stand in the middle and operate it with my right hand, or I could stand over here and operate with my left hand, depending on what I need to do given weight and balance and conditions. So here, with the kicker mounted on the starboard side, you can see I can stand over here, I can sit down on the gunnel, still reach the handle comfortably. I can stand in the middle right here, facing this direction if I need to, and operate the kicker. Also, when I turn full lock right, I'm not interfering with anything over here, even if this had higher sides. Same thing, turning full lock left, I'm not interfering with anything, and I'm not having to lean way over out the side of the boat, especially in the case of a boat like mine that has to run an extension handle. On my old boat, it was especially a problem. I had to lean way out over the side in order to turn the boat full starboard. I really think the kicker should be mounted on the starboard side. I don't know why every single manufacturer does it on the port side except for Alumaweld. Alumaweld is the only ones that I know that actually put the kicker over here. Actually, I guess I shouldn't say that because a lot of manufacturers, at least of these sleds, have it so you can mount the kicker on either side, but I would still only put the kicker on the starboard side. So I guess while I'm over here, we'll talk about tiller versus center console versus windshield boats. Tiller boats like this one have the advantage of one operator station. The driver stands here at the main, then he comes over here and operates the kicker, doesn't have to go anywhere. One, maybe two fish finders, and they both mount into, well, in this case, there's one fish finder in your electrical panel, and then mount your second fish finder on the outside if you need a second one for live scope or something like that, but you have to buy less fish finder. Another advantage to an open sled like this is there is so much room for activities. A lot of times these sleds will be used for guides. Sometimes your regular everyday recreational fishermen will use these sleds as well, though, just because they're so versatile, so much room. They do river fishing really, really, really well. And on a calm day, they'll also do ocean fishing fairly well as well, except for when the wind starts to pick up and then spray will come onto your passengers and likely you. Also, obviously, you're exposed to the elements if you don't have your bimini top up. Typically, these sleds will also have a fair amount of storage up here, as well as a lot of them will come with some semblance of seat boxes, which most guys like to run. I know some guys like to run the pedestal seats like this one because there's just a little bit smaller footprint. Some of these sleds will also come with rod storage underneath these in the gunnel doors here. Store fishing rods. And that's a feature that you won't see on most windshield boats. Some windshield boats are starting to come with that, but most of them, it hasn't made it that way yet. Center console boat. Obviously, we still have similar experience with single operator station. We have the advantage of having a steering wheel instead of the tiller handle to operate. Downside is you have this box in the middle of the boat. You can still get away with a single fish finder or 2 fish finders by just having it mounted up here, and it's easy to see back from the trolling station. Also, your net storage is very, very conveniently centrally located, which is nice. That's what this tube right here is, that's for his nets. Overall, it does give you a better view, I think, while you're driving, and definitely more control having a steering wheel versus a tiller. Although a lot of the larger tiller outboards now are coming with power steering, so you rotate the handle a little bit, and a hydraulic pump will actually do the turning of the motor for you. So it's very similar to having hydraulic steering in that you don't have the torque of the motor trying to turn the outboard on you. Same thing in this boat. We have seat boxes that are on adjustable sliders that can move back and forth. And this boat is set up for 4 clients. And then the captain and a deckhand can sit over here, or a deckhand can sit up there. And just like the Aluma-Weld next door, this boat has some underbow storage. Now let's talk about windshield boats. Big advantage, windshield. Keeps the wind off of you and rain when you're underway. Big disadvantage, windshield. It makes it harder to see when you're operating a kicker. Also, it gets in the way if you want to fish off the bow for like bass fishing. You do have to contend with this for your backswing for your bass rod. If you're tall like me, these folding tops are a pretty big disadvantage on any boat. On the sleds, they're actually even lower. Typically, they're about this tall, so you have to really crouch underneath them. It's meant to keep people dry while they're sitting, and for the captain to look over the top of and see where he's going. So it's a little bit less of a problem on a windshield boat because these are taller, but I still have to duck quite a ways in order to get inside of the top. Now, a big disadvantage of running a top is the visibility. When you're standing back here running the kicker, this is your view. I can't see much in front of me without actually ducking down, unless I roll the top up, which is doable, but even still, you can unzip the top right here, unsnap the front, roll this up, and keep the top up. But even still, it's reduced visibility here, although I will say it's slightly better on this boat than it is on my boat. So here's another folding top on the next class up of boat. This is that 20-foot Duckworth that we were looking at earlier. And you see I still kind of have to duck, although not quite as much as I did on the 17-foot Aluma-Weld. And here you can get an idea of the visibility with the top kind of rolled up. And this boat actually, you see on the Aluma-Weld over there, the side windows go up much higher than this one. So this one's actually blocking my visibility straight out to the sides without ducking down. And on my boat, this is even worse because it's like right here that the window starts, because there's a piece of fabric that is between the top of the zipper and the window. So my sidewalls actually come down to like right here. Visibility with my top up is absolutely terrible, which is why during fall salmon season, I actually take my top off so that I can see where I'm going. And then of course, there's the pilot house. These boats are much larger. I'm not gonna spend too much time on them, but I figured I'd mention it. A lot of times oh, is this locked? This is locked. Crap. Well, we'll just look in through the window here. Again, these typically get driven entirely up at the helm. Visibility out the back sucks. Sometimes, like this one in particular, has controls, at least controls for the kicker, steering for all of the engines, controls for the kicker at the rear station, and he's going to be looking through a window back here all the way through to the front to be able to see forward and poke his head around the side. But These boats are typically only used on the ocean or big open water, not so much in the Columbia River, or they won't be used so much for trolling tight areas like the Ghost Hole in Tillamook Bay. These guys are going out to the ocean. All right, I had to come out to the shiny new boats to show you this, but here we have an intermediate hardtop. So this is the same class of boat as my North River, but instead of being a soft top, this is a hard top. Biggest difference you'll see between this and say an offshore boat is the windshield is leaning back towards the driver instead of forward. You have the advantages of a hardtop in that this is never going to leak, but you have the disadvantages of a windshield boat. So also you can never take this top off, you're stuck with it. So what you have back here is your fishing area. I really like the versatility of my boat being able to take the soft top off and have more fishing area. It almost, not quite, but almost more like a sled than these boats are typically used. And finally, I want to talk about things to look for when you're shopping for a used boat. All of these things are going to kind of give you the totality of how the previous owner cared for the boat. You want to look for damage, especially on the bottom. See if it's had any hard impacts. That's not necessarily neglect, but if you see hard impact damage on the bottom, you want to make sure to look under the floor and make sure that there's no broken welds or structural damage underneath. It may not be an issue on boats that have a 1/4 inch bottom, but on boats that have a 3/16 bottom or even an 1/8 inch bottom, especially an 1/8 inch bottom, you're going to want to make sure that there's no structural damage if there is visible damage to the outside of the boat. Now, you're going to see dock rash. This boat, I don't know if you can see if we can make that show up there. Yeah, this boat's got a dent in it. That's not necessarily pretty, but that's also not the end of the world. Every boat's going to have dock rash on it the first time it touches a dock. The age of the electronics, that's a big deal. None of the boats that I have been looking at out here for this video have old electronics. But if the electronics are old and outdated, you've got to take that into account, that you might have to put a few $1,000s into buying some new electronics. And if you have 1 or 2 fish finders at the helm and a 3rd fish finder back at the kicker station, that price starts to add up really quick, especially when you start talking about things like radar, FLIR, GPS navigation, autopilots, things like that. Like, all of that really adds up when you have to replace it on somebody else's old boat. The condition of the interior will tell you a whole lot about how the previous owner took care of his boat. This 22-foot North River in particular is very clean. There's a little bit of wear on the floor I can see, but I see one little tiny, oh, nope, that's just a leaf. I thought that was a spot that was gouged on the floor. This is very clean in here. I don't like the fact that it has carpet in the gunnel trays. Carpet holds salt water, and that's not good. I also don't like the fact that it has carpet on the outside of the boxes. That's just, I don't like carpet in boats. It causes problems, especially in the salt water. But overall, this boat is extremely clean. There hasn't been a lot of leaking of salt water through the zippers here down onto the control panel, like on my boat. My control panel has some corrosion on it. And this boat's not old enough. This is newer than 2016 because it has this style transom area. So it's not that old. And I feel a tiny bit of corrosion right there. Some paint flaking off here, but overall, oh, here we go. Here's a little bit of corrosion right here. Surface corrosion up at the top, not that big of a deal, and you're going to have corrosion anywhere that you have stainless steel or water getting trapped. So in this case, around these fittings, around here, these rivets tend to get corroded out, and then underneath the snaps sometimes, if the snaps don't have this Mylar washer in between them and the aluminum, a lot of times you'll see corrosion in those points on certain manufacturers. I'm not going to call them out on video here, but certain manufacturers don't use those Mylar washers, and it causes corrosion to start bubbling the paint. Other common points of corrosion on a lot of boats is right here, especially if this seam isn't welded, at the edges of the paints. North Rivers, after 2016, they started welding the chine down the outside on here. On my 2014, this isn't welded. and the paint was all the way down there, that was a point of corrosion. So North River actually took my boat back to the factory, stripped it of the paint, and put a wrap on it. Wraps are absolutely the way to go, especially in salt water. Paint, something hits it, it cracks, it gets a scratch in it, and water will start working its way underneath and sitting there, and you'll start getting corrosion bubbles. I'm gonna look for some on this. Well, you can see here where the paint got actually scratched, and eventually with use in salt water, that can lead to corrosion bubbles. Also, you'll find corrosion in places like this that are just siliconed instead of welded. Salt water can work its way in there, sit, and start corroding. Again, it's not the end of the world. It can be indicative of how the boat was used and how it was cared for. It's something to look for. If you see corrosion on the bottom plate of the boat or anywhere below the water line, if you see a lot of corrosion, right, like this seam is not welded right here. If you see a lot of corrosion in these areas, that is indicative of future problems that are very expensive to repair. Pay attention to the corrosion, but don't necessarily be scared off, especially for anything that's above the water line or that's not attached to anything structural. Another common point of corrosion is on carpeted bunks, especially with saltwater use. So if we look underneath here, yes, this bunk is only carpet. What happens is the salt water gets held in the carpet, and you can't rinse it out without actually like dunking your trailer in fresh water. So if it takes you a little while to do that, and you can't just rinse it off with hose because it's up against the hull. So that salt water is sitting there, and you'll have corrosion exactly where the bunks sit. The better solution is what's on this North River, and I saw it on the Thunderjet there over there too, is this has these rubber pads that sit on top of the carpet, and you'll notice there's light. I can get my finger in between the boat and the carpet here. So that allows, and those rubber pads are ribbed. That lets you rinse the salt water out from there, so that way salt water is not sitting against the hull. A lot of guys want their boats to be shiny. Not sure why, but they don't like it when the aluminum has this dull look. And this is actually the natural state of the aluminum protecting itself. Exposed aluminum is safe aluminum. When the aluminum is painted, that's when water can get trapped. Now, wraps like this has, if the wrap gets damaged, that's not the end of the world, because then the aluminum is just exposed. You can see right here, the aluminum is exposed. But where the wrap is not damaged right next to it, it's sealed. It's not going to get salt water stuck in it, versus paint where it starts to bubble and then more and more water gets in there and starts the corrosion process, and then you get more and more stuck underneath the paint until you flake the paint off and then expose the aluminum. With a wrap, take the old wrap off, put the new wrap on, and now it's all sealed again and it's just fine, or it's exposed. There's no in between where it's not sealed, but it's also not exposed, trapping water. A couple of other points to look at when you're looking at a used boat. Is the bilge clean? Are the electronics clean? Is the wiring job good? You do not want to have a ground going through the hull. So don't run a hot wire and then run your ground wire to the hull and then have the hull hooked up to the battery and have the negative side running through the hull. That is a very fast way to make your boat disappear via electrolysis. Guaranteed problems. Always run a ground wire back to the battery or to a bus bar that is only grounded to the battery and is isolated from the hull. The only place that the negative should be touching the electrical system is through the outboard. Because where the outboard mounts right there, that is going to ground the hull to the battery, but you don't have electrical current going through that because the outboard is also directly connected to the battery. Well, that is going to wrap up this video. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully I helped you make a decision on what kind of boat you want for your use case and certain things to look for, features to look for in a used boat, or I guess a new boat. Just remember, a boat's only new once. Once you start using it, all aluminum boats are going to have all of the same problems, knowing about them and being able to mitigate them, being able to take care of your investment so you can make more memories on the water is extremely important. And of course, when you're buying a used boat, make sure that previous owner took care of it like he was going to have it forever as well. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you on the next video. Bye.